So I'll get started. My name is Gregory Luce. I'm the executive director of Adoptees United. I'm not on the board. The board is my boss, actually, and that includes Annette O'Connell, who's on in the event and will be involved in the chat and seeking out questions, as well as Shauna Hodgson is also on the AU board, and she'll be doing the same thing. I don't see any other board members. We usually try to introduce them if I do. But if there's a board member on here that I don't see, let me know. I will say that we've been pretty quiet over the summer. It's kind of a weird summer, I think, for a lot of people. I felt like in some ways we all needed a break. So we didn't do too many events over the summer. We're starting to get back into doing some. I'm working with Annette to do one on search angels, not only search angels for domestic adoptees, but people who do birth searches for intercountry adoptees, because that's often ignored when we talk about searching. And I think that needs to be brought into the picture. In fact, Ostrid, I'll probably be talking to you about who does that kind of work. And we have a small retreat, board retreat coming up in 2 weeks, which is why this event is really useful to us, because we are looking at all sorts of things: strategy, structure, what AU could become, what it is now. And one of the biggest issues is, how do you sustain an organization with funding? And so we wanted to hear from as many people as possible about what their priorities are if we had infinite money, which means as much money as you need, which is unrealistic, but it's something that gets the ideas out there and flowing. And I had this conversation with Shalise on the podcast, the AU podcast. It was months ago, and I think that's in the chat as a link. It's a really fun conversation. We came up with really my pet project is a legal clinic, free or low cost, to intercountry adoptees as well as domestic adoptees with legal issues. We all know generally what those legal issues are. And I think Shalise, and I'll introduce Shalise and Ostrid here in a second, wanted a research institute, as far as I remember, right? Something like that. And then I brought up beer, or making sure that we have some fun along the way as well. So that's really what that started this conversation, and we're going to continue it tonight with everybody, or as many people who can participate. Let me before I forget, anyone who needs the live transcript, I'll let that, you can request it and we'll turn it on. There we go. So I want to make sure that you check out Adoption Mosaic, which is where Shalise and Ostrid work. And we'll put that in the chat as a link. But I want each of you, Ostrid, Castro, and Shalise, Shalise, I always get your last name wrong, so I'll let you pronounce it. Introduce yourself, and Ostrid, I'll go with you first. If you could introduce yourself and tell people what you do, and a little bit about your background.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. It's so good to see familiar faces and some new faces. Some of you, I think I know your name more than I know your face. So yeah, hopefully you'll turn your camera on so I can marry the two together. But hello, good evening. I think most people are in the evening at this time, in whatever time zone you're in. My name is Ostrid Castro. I am the CEO and director, founder of Adoption Mosaic. And I came to this work, as many of us do, I was adopted myself when I was 4.5. My sister was 6 years old, and we came to the United States and were adopted by a loving, kind, wonderful couple who were clueless and completely unaware of what it meant to adopt children, older children, children who spoke a different language, children who had the traumas that we had. And so they were just, kind of in the 70s. Unfortunately, it still happens today, but they were just clean slate adoption, love them as if you gave birth to them, and they will grow up to be healthy, happy individuals. Uh, and um, and so and when I was 18 years old, I decided that I wanted to work in adoptions. And I'm going to age myself here, but when I was 18 years old, um, there was one place. If you were an adopted person, there was one place for you to go if you wanted to work in adoptions, and that was in a placement agency. And at that time, I thought, I had a pretty good upbringing, and I feel good about being raised for the most part in the way that I was raised. So sure, I'll go help create other families. Very quickly found out that that is not the work that I could do, for lots of different reasons. Realized that a lot was coming up for me as an individual, my own adoption stuff, and being as young as I was, I definitely knew that there was something wrong with the system and that we needed to make some changes, but I didn't have very many mentors or people in my life that were adoptees who had done this work for years before me. And so I went to my first conference, adoption related conference, and met some people who are my mentors now: Dr. J. Ron Kim, Susan Bronco, Amanda Baden, just some really heavy hitters when it comes to knowing their adoption stuff. And realized that there was a lot to be done in the world of adoption and creating support and resources. And so after working at the Oregon Post-Adoption Resource Center here in Oregon, which is where I am located, I worked there for 5 years. And creating curriculum and trainings around transracial adoption, how to talk with kids about adoption, did some youth activity groups. I realized that I needed to branch off because the work that I was doing at Orr Park was limited in that we were not allowed to support families that had not adopted through the child welfare system. And that made me realize that, so that means I'm working at a place that if my parents were to call this agency or organization, they weren't a placement agency, but this organization, my adult self would have to turn them away and say, I'm sorry, we are not allowed to serve you because you adopted internationally. So that's what led me to launching Adoption Mosaic, and I launched Adoption Mosaic with 3 other adoptive parents. I was the face of the organization. The 3 of them were kind of behind the scenes, creating the 501c3, building the board of directors, doing all the legwork that I didn't really have an interest in. And so then, as the years went on, we started bringing in board members that were other representatives of the adoption constellation, adoptees, birth and first parents. And then I left my job at Orr Park and was full-time, kind of like what Greg did, which was step down from the board and became the executive director and was leading the organization and managing as the executive director, managing a board of directors, and just navigating what it meant to have a 501c3. And I bring this up because I think this is going to be a part of the conversation that I hope we will have. And I have adoptees who reach out to me all the time now asking me, I don't know whether I want to do an LLC or 501c3. What do you think? And my experience in running a nonprofit 501c3 was a lot that I did not sign up for, that I didn't expect that I would have to do, because all I wanted to do was just create programs. I just wanted to create programs to serve my community. So we found ourselves chasing fundraising dollars and trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, writing grants for things that just really weren't exactly our mission, but the $500 was really going to help us keep our doors open. So finding ourselves being compromised as a result, and really just deciding to shut the doors after 10 years of serving our community. Then I about 4.5 years, I decided that I was going to relaunch Adoption Mosaic as an LLC, and I have done that. I did it, relaunched it 2 months into the pandemic. And unfortunately, the pandemic is the best thing that ever happened to Adoption Mosaic, reaching people and getting to meet people like all of you. This would not have happened previously. And Shalise and I were working in the 501c3 Adoption Mosaic version. And when I was relaunching, I was calling her saying, "Are you ready now? How about now? Do you want to, can we like jump back on board and do this together again?" And she finally said yes. So we've been building it ever since.
Thanks, Astrid. I mean, and we'll get into these issues too, because one of the questions that we're going to ask is, how do you value yourself within this adoptee community space, and why are we? I think I'm accurate on this. We often undervalue what we do as advocates or activists. And so we'll talk about that, because I'm fascinated by you're starting it as a for-profit business or nonprofit, and then moving into what's a for-profit business model, and the sort of the pros and cons of that, but also what it means to be in this business, which we, as a nonprofit, you're still a business. Shalise, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and what you do?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Greg and Adoptees United, for having Astrid and I. Greg and I had such a great conversation, so I'm glad to bring it to an audience. Hi, everyone. I am Shalise Giesecke. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am the head of operations at Adoption Mosaic. Fortunately for me, Astrid went forth into the world and worked at a placement agency, so people like me could work in adoption and not have to work at a placement agency. And so I have been able to call her my mentor and my friend for almost 15 years, coming up on more. I am also an intercountry South Korean interracial adoptee. I was adopted as an infant and raised by a white family on a farm in Minnesota. I have 3 siblings. They are my parents' biological children. I have searched for my Korean family, and I am not in reunion. Much like Astrid, I had a very loving family who kind of adhered by the same love them as if they were born to you philosophy. They were not adoption fluent or trauma informed, and I was also an adoptee that was raised in racial and cultural isolation, as well as adoptee isolation. And I'm really, even though I was raised in Minnesota, which has many, many adoptees, I had very few. I had some adoptee acquaintances and friends, but we had no language to talk about this experience we were all sharing, except for maybe this kind of underlying feeling of survival, that we were all in it to survive. And I'm really excited to talk about this topic. Like Astrid, I started working at Adoption Mosaic when it was a nonprofit, and then took a break, and I had a couple of kids and was focusing on parenting. And then Astrid brought me back into the fold, and now we are functioning as a for-profit business, which is a totally different way to look at it and approach things. And so I think there's a lot of, I would say in reflection, I feel like it might, in this day and age, it might be easier to be a nonprofit and get funding depending on what your programming focus is now than it was in the time of adoptionmosaic.org. We like to distinguish it as adoptionmosaic.org or .com.
And I think they both still exist, right? I mean, on the web. Or maybe.
I think we've recently been able to kind of bury or get rid of the
Oh, okay.
.org.
All right. Yeah. So if
It's
people
been
find
it's
.org
been a
and
process.
right. Yeah. Anything else, Shalise? Start getting into the questions.
Yeah, well, I think, part of the reason I was reflecting on how the, access to funding now versus then is one, even though it doesn't always feel like it, and I know, Greg, I was telling you I was feeling a little cynical, but there have been, I think in the mid 2000s, social media didn't exist like it does now. And there wasn't, I mean, I feel like now there's so much more adoptee presence in the world, and it may not be how it as much as it should be or where we want it to be, but there is so much more. And I think that is one of the benefits of longevity in this area, is that you have the privilege of seeing that there is some progress being made, however slow and incremental it is. And I think now there would be a lot more opportunities for like big funders to be more open, especially, I mean, I think at adoptionmosaic.org, we really wanted to make programs for adult adoptees, but it was so hard to find funders in which we could fall under one of their categories, since we're not social workers, we're not a mental health organization. That's not our main goal. It's just to normalize and create community and provide support for adult adoptees. And that was really hard to fund. I mean, part of it too is like that I didn't get into it to be a fundraiser. Like didn't know anything about um, fundraising and development, nonprofit development. Just we were both, everyone was sort of learning on the fly, but there just didn't seem to be much out there. And, of course, the dominant narrative about adoption, it's really hard to convince people that post-adoption services matter in 2 pages.
Right. And matter to adult adopted people.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Right. And so that was a real challenge. And I think now, .com side, it's a little easier. It's just more fluid because you're not dealing as with boards and as many other people and interests, and it's kind of one of those things, like, you can do it if you can make the money, if you can find your own money for it.
Right.
So it feels a little more loose and flexible than the .org.
Yeah. And sort of getting back to this first question about how we're valued for our work, and I think it's an important question to talk about, because I have the experience of being both. My law firm is an LLC, or a professional limited liability company, and so it's technically a for-profit business, but I constantly undervalue my work. I'm constantly saying I really shouldn't charge adopted people for what I do. It's not fair. They shouldn't be in this spot in the first place, whether they lack citizenship or they just want a birth certificate. And so I constantly undervalue that. And I put more money into that for-profit business than I get out of it. I love the work, and that's why I do it. But it's work that, and I think this is familiar with a lot of people, it's work subsidized by your partner or spouse or someone else in your family, often, who has a regular sort of, traditional or non-traditional job that helps you do that work. And it shouldn't be that way. I think it should be that should be adoption. I don't even call them adoption professional, adoptee rights, people who are paid for their work. And that's a key thing for me to do. And so on the other side, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit organization where the struggle is always trying to raise money so you can do programming. I do want to thank, and for instance, tonight, I want to thank all the people who donated, because that's our model right now, is sort of just voluntary donations if they feel like the programming we're doing is good, or we occasionally get just donations out of the blue. And that's kept us going. I get a very small stipend each month as executive director. It's important that whatever positions that we take on, if someone's doing a position, then they should be paid for that. And we also pay our panelists on these events. And it's been, let me just hold on just a sec. And that's been from the get-go of Adoptees United, that we need to value the work that we do, even if it's a small amount of compensation, because that's important as you start to build the organization and put that in as the model. And I think part of the issue, I think, and maybe I'll throw this over to Astrid and Shalise, is the whole idea of money within adoption is problematic already. And so how do you get around charging for some services or talking about money without it feeling weird? And I think it often feels weird. Like we're getting, and somehow we're exploiting other adoptees by charging them for services that we do. You know, we have search angels that are typically supposed to be free. And I will say one last thing. On the law firm side, I finally said, okay, I can charge at least, $500 for going to court and getting an original birth certificate and getting court records, or my client could go to the adoption agency and pay them $900 and get nothing out of it. So I'd rather be competing with the adoption agency that gives them nothing typically. And I'm able to have some adoptees pay that flat fee for those services. But Astrid or Shalise or both, how have you struggled to value your work, or how people perceive the value of your work?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to go back to a comment that you said, as far as like most of us have spouses or partners that support us. And that's not always the case. Some of us have chosen to live a really frugal life in order to do this work. And to live without, and because this work is that important. And so how we value ourselves, and I mean, there's been times where I've felt like, if people just knew, like, yes, we're moving from LLC. I mean, we're moving from .org to .com. And whenever I hear Shalise or anyone say, oh, you're now a for-profit business, I just start laughing. I'm like, in what world? I don't know. But valuing myself, like getting to a place where I know that my work is impeccable, and there's very few people that do what I do in the world, and that I've been doing this for 30 years, and the history that I bring, and all of this. And that to me is what gets me to saying yes to charging for the services and that's just me. I know that other people have gotten their PhDs and have done other things that they have to pay back, or that they have to that they should be valued financially. I really have always struggled with that. I've always struggled because I feel like I, as a young person, needed this support and needed these resources and needed to access them at no cost, or my adoptive parents needed to pay for those services. And my parents were the first to say, oh, sure, you need therapy, but there were no therapists out there who were adoption competent, actually supporting. So they were, putting money into the wrong places. So valuing myself and getting to a place where I say that my work is worth what I charge. The way that I have balanced that is that at Adoption Mosaic, we don't ever turn away an adoptee who's needing services. And so if our services, we will always say this is what our services cost, because we think that our community needs to know that and understand that. Our adoptee community needs to understand that as well. And you deserve to have resources and support, and you will never be turned away. And until that's a problem, meaning like we can't financially serve the people that are coming and asking for scholarships, we will always, and at that point, we'll figure out a solution to that problem as well. But yeah, but it's a struggle. And I actually think that is a struggle that I don't necessarily ever want to get rid of, if that
So you
makes
think it's a
sense.
positive struggle?
I don't know that I'm not sure that I would use the word positive. I would say it's the struggle that reminds me that this, I'm not in this work to make money. I'm not in this. Yeah, I'm in this work, and this is my life career, and this is what I will do until my dying day. But I don't expect fancy things in my life, because this is a life that I have chosen to live. And if I wanted fancy things that cost a lot of money, I would go and do a different career. But what I gain from it, my soul and how I feel about my everyday and going to bed, is worth every penny. Is worth it.
Right. I think that's a really good point. That, why I may seemingly complain about putting more money in than I get out. It's really what I get out is working with adopted people and helping with their issues. And you said something I just realized that I do too, is I don't turn anyone away who I think needs legal help. We just figure out how to, either it's free or there's a small payment. But yeah, I have that same model. I just now realized that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's the both and, we at Adoption Mosaic, and I think a lot of people are starting to have a lot more conversations about the both and the both and is, and it totally sucks that to keep my doors open, and to that we ask so many people to give their time and energy, even to this day, including myself, and that we're not in a position to be able to financially financially pay them what they deserve. And when we do panels, we give an honorarium of $40. With the amount of time and energy and lived experience that these individuals have, they deserve more than $40. Absolutely.
Right.
And that's where we are for right now. So it's that both and.
Right. And Shalice, you talked about trying to get grants when it was the nonprofit, when it was the .org, and talk a little bit more about what made that so difficult.
Well, I think part of it is there's no lack of grant availability for children's programming. But for adults, it's a lot harder unless it's, specifically tied to mental health. And also too, as an organization that was essentially one and like a fourth of a person. So Oshud was working 60 hours a week. I was only supposed to be working like 10 hours a week. I think I only supposed to be working 10 hours a week.
I think so. Yeah. I think didn't we bump it up to 20 at the end?
Yeah. Which is actually part of the reason I didn't go back to working at the .org after I had my first child, because I knew the balance of getting all the things need to be done. We need to do this work. We need to help these people. And I just knew I would struggle with that balance between being present in two places.
Right.
But yeah, I think at the time, one is, I know in the poll, there was a lot of, a few comments about changing the dominant narrative of adoption, trying to get people to understand that this is a very nuanced and complex lifelong experience that requires specific services and specific areas of understanding that don't really exist, or if they do, very little. And so I think and now I think with the murder of George Floyd and some of that kind of more racial awakening, if you will, I feel like accessing services for interracial or transracial adoptees would probably be an easier argument to make. I think too, there's a little more acceptance that being separated from your parents at birth is classified as a traumatic experience. So you have some like medical, and part of it, some of the challenge too was like everything, all these like larger traditional grantors, they want evidence-based programs. And I mean, 1.25 people, we don't even have the money to create the systems that create the evidence to prove the efficacy and need of these programs. We just know as people who live this experience and are in the community that it's absolutely necessary. And it's very hard to convince traditional grantors that's the case.
Right.
If you're not saying like 60% of these people say, and I think there's so little research, and there's a lot more than there used to be. So I think that is also one of the things that's more helpful, right? Because there's a lot more adult adoptees who have become academics and scholars and done more research. And so there's more research to reference. And yet it's probably, it's still a challenge. And at the time we were writing grants, it was very much a challenge.
Right. There's some questions that have come up, and maybe a good time to talk about some of these. But one was from Elizabeth saying, do donors always want a 501c3 organization to donate to, or will they donate to an LLC.com because it is a worthwhile organization? And I guess if I were to answer that, it depends. It always depends. If you have a worthwhile thing that you're doing, GoFundMe is a classic example. Those aren't nonprofits. Those aren't 501c3s, and people give hundreds of thousands of dollars to the right cause. Even my law firm, if a client needs a filing fee, and the filing fees for USCIS are massive, sometimes they're at $1,200. When I put word out there that my client needs help with that, I get it within 2 days, and the client is able to pay that fee. So I think that has to be very specific. The 501c3, people do, especially in estate planning or planned giving, will give out large amounts to organizations that they feel are doing good things, and that has to be a 501c3. So it's a little bit of both. And then Elise asked about difference. Essentially, they're more willing to give to a 501c3 because of the tax deduction, or a 501c4. And the difference between that is the 501c3 has some limits on lobbying, although those limits really, if we are to look at Adoptees United as an example, we can do quite a bit of legislative advocacy as a 501c3. You just can't, support. You can't endorse a candidate. You can't give money to a candidate. There's certain restrictions, and then a portion of what you do can be direct lobbying as well. And a 501c4, I think people are going to be, it depends. They may give money to that, but I think the tax deduction does make a big difference to people, especially with, planned giving things. If we're talking about a lot of money, not talking about, a little bit here and there. So thanks, Shauna.
I just want to pipe in really quick and say one of the things that we have found, and I think that this is when we're talking about the small giving donations, that we are finding that people aren't asked, and they aren't saying, "Oh, are you a 501c3 so I can donate?" When it comes to buying an extra ticket for We the Experts, so an adoptee, or buying or donating enough for our community fund, so adoptees can then receive our services for free. We're not seeing that people are well, I would, unless you were a 501c3, and that's a smaller giving amounts. I think that as soon as you start getting into the larger giving, that's where people are more likely to start asking that. But we have found that our community, anybody who probably donated for this, right, bought an extra ticket or something, our community is really giving.
They are.
Yeah. And I've been really blown away with that and really impressed.
Let me get in. We can talk about this as adoptive parents sort of as a source for funding later, but this is an example of if I petitioned to be admitted to the U.S. Supreme Court so I could practice before the U.S. Supreme Court. Not that that'll ever happen, but it's an option. And the cost, I put this on Twitter, and this cost was $200 for the application fee. And adoptive parents stepped up and gave me $200 because it is a very giving community, I think. And if you have the right cause, people will give to it. And I found that true whether I was in business as a law firm or on the other side, our .org of Adoptees United, people are giving. I just want to try to make that giving more shared among people who benefit from adoption. Adoptive parents is often probably the largest financial pot of money out there. Whether we need to target them as well for good causes, I don't know. I think it's, but let me just put, and we talk about the bigger money. The small money, I think we do fairly well. I mean, this is an example of people who giving to this program lets us do this program, pay honoraria, pays for all the technical stuff we have to do behind the scenes. And that's been really great because it allows us to do the work. But just to put all this big money into perspective, there's a meeting at the Catholic University of America in late September. And I'm writing about this right now. And at that meeting were a number of organizations. And topic of the meeting was the role of adoption in a post-Dobbs America. And the organizations that were there through their representatives included the National Council for Adoption. That's a large trade association that represents adoption agencies across the country. They have a net assets of $600,000 and an annual payroll, an annual revenue exceeding $1 million, and a payroll of at least $260,000. Live Action News, that's a pro-life Christian news network. They were there. They have contributions because they're a 501c3 of $4 to $7 million every year, and they have payroll of more than $1 million. Louisiana Right to Life, and as Elise knows, they vehemently opposed the bill in Louisiana. They were at that meeting. They have annual revenue exceeding $1 million and a payroll of nearly $300,000. Christian Alliance for Orphans, they were very prominently featured in Child Catchers by Catherine Joyce. They were at the meeting. They have annual revenue of $2.5 million and annual payroll of more than $1 million. The Opt Institute, and this is one that's really interesting. It's new. It's one man who's an adopted person who's funded a research institute for purposes of promoting adoption and increasing domestic adoption. That's a $5 million foundation, and they're giving out research grants to study ways to increase domestic infant adoption. And so this is what we're up against when we talk about money interests and trying to figure out how, and I don't know if money is the solution. Organizing is often a major solution, but I think this gets into sort of the next question. Let me bring that up. Because money is a big deal, and money will allow us to do certain things if we want to change the narrative. I don't think you can get around not having the funds and the ability financially to do it. That's just my opinion. Some people may think differently, but I think we've always lacked the resources to do what we need to do. And so what would our movement look like? And I open it up to everybody. And adoption with sufficient funding for adoptee-centered work. And morning, what if you have thoughts on that, Shalise or Astrid or anyone else in the chat?
I think that it would, even with if the money's there, the organizing is still going to be a challenge. One, because as a population, we are people raised in isolation. And so we don't have the benefit of attending a church since infanthood through adulthood and, feeling a part of that community and giving all our money to that. And I think because our experiences are so individual, it will be hard. And also we're all traumatized people, and sometimes we're hard to work with each other. And I
True.
think that is part of the reason organizing is a challenge, is that I think to be a leader in organization, you have to have a lot of patience, empathy, compassion, room to hold all the space for all the people. And yet there would be organizations and organizers who don't want to do that. They want you to be at this spot in this mindset, and then we can go forward. And we all come to consciousness or out of the fog, however you want, we can't even we have a hard time agreeing on how to describe pieces of our experience. That's how individual it is, right? We all use different language and words for it. And so I think that can be really challenging when we're trying to organize across something. And also too, I think we want to have one thing for everyone, for all adoptees, but we can't be all things to all people. And so what I think we need is, money for sure. Absolutely. And maybe a central place where you can get the money would be great.
Right.
Um,
We're talking infinite
and
money too. So
yeah. But I think what we really need is connection and collaboration and awareness, because there are tons of Instagram influencers that talk about adoption, or, adoptee TikTok. And yet they might not be able to tell you 5 other people who are doing advocacy work in adoption, because that's how disconnected we are. Even though they're on a platform that is, their whole point is to connect people, we are very disconnected as well. So I think, maybe a central place for money, but also I know in the poll comments, there was something about like, a central database of all the people of doing whatever the work, because I think, because we come to this experience often in isolation, we think, what this world needs, this thing which I really needed, without knowing that there's other organizations that they could either contribute or join without having to start their own. And of course, because of the lack of money and lack of skills and resources, sometimes the burnout is real, right? In much of activism and advocacy, that's also a challenge. But I think it's like working together, and that unifying thing, being unified but having space for everybody is a challenge.
Mhm. I think you just summed up exactly what all the hard things are about organizing adopted people and organizing them for change. I mean, I think that burnout is one, and we're all different, and some of us think that we know the way to go forward, and that we have multiple organizations all over the world. But I think we're making progress. But I think for me, I think that there's a greater chance to make greater progress with more resources. We just don't know how to do that. I don't think it's never been done in this community. I think NACASEC may be an example where they have a large organization. NACASEC is I forget what the whole acronym is, but they are organizers, and they are supported by a larger, their advocacy for adoptees is supported by a larger organization. That's the one example I think that out there that does have sufficient funding for adoptee rights work.
NACAC is North American Council for Adoptable Children.
That's NACA. I'm thinking this is NACASEC, which is a Korean adoptee or Korean oriented community organization. Yeah,
Gotcha.
they're fairly large, but not NAC. Yeah, NACAC.
I thought you were talking about NACAC.
No, they've been a really good ally in some of the work that we do too. Actually, NACAC. Oscar, did you have any thoughts on the things that we're talking about?
Yeah. Surprise, surprise. I do have some thoughts. Yeah, it's one of the things I like with the pandemic, and it's for some of us, it's only been 2 years that we actually found our community. And for, I remember when we did our very first, I think it was in March or April, I think, our first We the Experts online. And I had people messaging me. We had, I think for our very first panel discussion, we had maybe 48 people show up. When I do them in person live in a city, we'll get 20 people showing up. And then we got, I think, up to 120 people in one of the events that we did. And I remember, Greg, you've had a couple of turnouts where you're like, wow, our community really wants to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
And how exciting that is. And I feel like when you say nobody's doing this, I feel like exactly what Shilly said, until we find each other and we build community with like-minded. And just because we're adoptees does not mean that we're like-minded. We know that for sure. And so where do we find each other? Where historically have we found each other? Historically, I feel like we found each other at conferences, in-person conferences. And those were only for those people who knew about them and would get to them. And the very few of us even would know when there was an adoption conference. So I do feel like
too.
And they're super expensive. And if you're presenting at one, then nobody's going to pay you unless you're the keynote.
Right.
And so, historically, very, very few adoptees were ever keynotes and at most of these conferences. So, yeah. So I think that the idea of like finding each other and building and getting to know each other, I feel like is where we are in the industry right now with building adoptee programming.
Right. I think what I'll do now, unless anyone else has any comments, I'll go. So I haven't taken the poll. It's a fairly small number of responses. I think maybe 60 some, but it's worthwhile going through it to get people to think about what other people see as a priority. And I can't say that I listed everything that maybe on people's minds as to funding. We tried to keep it fairly general. But I'll share my screen and go through. It's the best way to look at it. But I also encourage people to look at the comments that a lot of people made. Those are anonymous, and because they're really useful comments that people have provided to us. And I think as we meet as a board later, they will be really informative for us to be reading through those. But let me hold on for a second as I share my screen. All right, hold on. And do you see the poll results here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it looks like I can't remember how many. It's probably up to about 70, and we hope to get more as it goes along. But most people, the vast majority, are adopted people. 11 identified as intercountry adoptees, 11 as transracial, 1 as a late discovery, 10 as within the LGBTQ community. In race, which I think typically for many people means Black adoptees who are adopted by Black parents, or it may mean white adoptees adopted by white parents, or the same race. So I'm not sure if this one is accurate, but 15 because there's some confusion over the term. 7 identified as disabled. No step-parent kinship adoptees. Former foster youth are 7. 3 adoptive parents. Thanks, adoptive parents, for participating. 3 birth parents. Thanks for that. And then getting into the list. This is if you could list as many as you wanted that you thought you'd like to see funding. More than 50 listed legislative and policy advocacy, so the vast majority. But out there as well are obviously post-adoption services for adult adopted people, sophisticated media campaigning, trauma-informed health and or mental health services, adoptee-driven research, and 48 said free or low-cost legal clinics for adopted people. 40 said National Adoptee Rights Resource Center. But what's interesting is when you switch to say, okay, you only can pick one out of all of those that you wanted. The 19, not even a majority, pick legislative policy and advocacy. Next is trauma-informed health and mental health services. Then is media campaigns or public awareness. And then we have post-adoption services. And then my pet project is way down here with 5 of a legal clinic, and then adoptee driven research is 5 too. So I think that's really interesting to see that, and I'm wondering how that's going to play out over time. And again, what will also inform these choices, which you're set in what you can pick, are some of the comments that we're receiving as well, who say, well, you need to add this, and we do have a questions like, what do we not include that should have been included on this list of priorities? And so I'd encourage you to read through those as well. The other thing I thought was interesting, it's just changed since I looked at it last actually, is that initially the majority of the people were not in a place where they could donate money. And I'm not saying that this is not a poll where we're going to say, okay, now we can target these people to try to give money. No, this is just to figure out what capacity exists as adopted people to support the work financially. And I don't know if it exists out there. And at first it looked like it probably doesn't, but maybe there is, in small amounts. And again, this goes to the small amount donations versus the larger amounts. And where do you get the larger amounts to do the things you really want to do if we had infinite money? So that's the current poll results. And obviously the comments that we've also posted publicly, although they're anonymous, are available in the chat. Go ahead.
Greg, can you
Mhm.
scroll down to the last one?
Mhm.
If that question was, if the people who were filling it out were putting it into perspective as far as like money, dollars versus time, and how that would be like, how many of us give our time to building community, and we don't ever put a dollar amount behind that. Right. So, I mean, maybe you do because you're an attorney, and so like billable hours that your industry, trains you to think that way, for sure, more so than I think like the social work world and other places. And so I would be super curious, because like in dollar amounts, I would be maybe in that up to $100 a year, but time wise, I'm probably $50,000 a year.
Right. I that's a really great insight. And my initial response to that is that I would love to get more people involved as volunteers, people who want to give their time. It's just there's a limited capacity to manage people who want to volunteer. And so I think if you had more money to support organizations to build volunteering,
absolutely, it costs money.
You're going to be able to get more volunteers because you have that capacity to, because it's really doesn't do anyone any good. And I know you know this, but to advertise for volunteers and then they're not supervised well and they have a negative experience in volunteering, or you don't know where to put them, or it's not a good structured program. And so I think that's where really money could make a difference in building the capacity to have people who want to donate time because they don't have the money to donate. And I think I hear for all the time, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And I don't think we're taking full advantage of people who have that ability for donating time. And in the Zoom world now, it's not that hard to do.
Well, and I will say, I can't tell you how many times people would say, oh, well, PSU, Portland State University, they've got students who need hours for bloody, bloody, blah. And we did that one year at Adoption Mosaic. And whew, talk about sucking every minute of our day, managing a classroom of 28 students. And at the end of the day, we got a product that was like, yeah, what are we going to do with that? I mean, really. And it didn't help us get any grants. From what I remember, but it's consumed us, because managing 28 students to do a service project for your organization, I think you have to be a pretty big organization to say yes to that and have it administer well.
Right.
Be administered. Yeah.
Yep. So this gets into the question of what could or should we fund? I mean, and these are opinions. These are driven by organizations that want to do the work, and so their priorities may be different from our priorities as Adoptees United, and maybe different from Adoption Mosaic, which is does very different work from AU, but it intersects as well. So I'm wondering, and I gave this question to Shalise on the podcast, and we came up with the two pet projects, as well as having a little bit of fun. But I'm wondering, if anyone wants to raise their hand and have their own ideas, what their priority may be, please do. But Shalise, are you still keen on having a research institute that could essentially counteract, or not even counteract, but produce research-oriented publications that would forward our narrative?
Yeah, I think it's kind of tied with a foundation, though, a funding foundation. So, maybe it's individual organizations don't need as much marketing and promotional savvy when they can just come to a place and say, we want to do this program, and then just get the money. It's not like you don't have to make the case for adopted people, that's already been made. And so I think that would be great, right? Like I want to, have it's kind of like, or, even if it's for like things like, I want to start a local Adoptees Connect.
Right.
And we want money to do events, or, I want my organization to be able to have this thing. And I'd love to see more money that way, where it's just easier to get. I think the research is one that's personally interesting to me. And I think it is important and it is important in ways to counteract the research that's already out there. And I think especially with this sort of post-Roe environment we're going to be in, clearly talking about the meeting you mentioned, there's going to be a lot of research out there that's going to be promoting adoption. I mean, there is already, but I think we need a stronger counter to that. But I would be hard pressed to pick between which one. But I mean, right now, as much as I love the research part, and I think there are some organizations that are trying to support adoptee researchers and their programs, but a foundation whose sole purpose is hitting up those celebrities, all those famous adoptive parents, like creating this pool of money for people to access. I think, that would be.
Don't you think it's a hard sell to most major donors? That
it is.
Because we don't follow the script that the normal, the dominant narrative and script of adoption.
But I think if that was your main focus and that's all you were doing was trying to sell adoption in a new way, the experience, right? It's like talking about identity autonomy, or
Right.
trying to reframe adoption in a different way. And if that's what your job was, only to do that, but not to do that so you could do the other work that you want to be doing, but like just doing that and then just giving the money, giving the money to people who are doing the work that they want to be doing, I think would be awesome. And it would be hard. I mean, I think you would have to have a team of really clever, masterful, crafty people to do that. But I think they exist, because organizations like National Council for Adoption exist, and they sound like they're for everybody, and they're not.
Right.
Because they should be called National Council for Adoption Placement, or for adoption agencies.
Right.
Because that's what their focus is. But they they put themselves out there as for adoption, and everybody kind of thinks that's as a general thing. So, well, I mean, I could be for adoption too, but it's just a way different facet of adoption. But I think it's just like, I don't know. And also just being a squeaky wheel, And this part of it is with the burnout, right? It's hard to do that all the time, like hounding adoptive parents. And
Right.
I think that's also one of the hard things about capturing adoptive parent money is that they don't have communities like adult adoptees have. They often, much like adoptees, they are raising their kids in isolation without a lot of community support. And so I think sometimes it's kind of hard. Astrid, tell me if you agree with me. But a lot of times we're accessing adoptive parent money through adoptees that we've already met that need the services. And then we're not just finding random adoptive parents who are like, oh, yeah, I'd love to give money to you. So I think they are a very large, a potential source of a large amounts of money, but it's part of it is trying to figure out how do you connect with all of them
Right.
outside of an adoption agency, which is, part of the reason they have success in their fundraising is that they still have contact with these adoptive families. So if you are an organization or a person that's trying to organize without the system, outside of the system of adoption, I think that they are kind of, adoptive parents are kind of a hard audience to reach.
Right. Astrid, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was just, yes, Shalise, of course, very much agree with you. And before we pushed open the room to everybody, Greg, you had shared the survey, the poll with us. And I had said, it would be an interesting question to ask how many of you either feel comfortable or have parents who would give to this work. Right. And I think that it's exactly right, Shalise. Like we have parents, but through their adoptees who has said this stuff is important. I need you to acknowledge how important this is, and they then come back and say, okay, can I sign up for a workshop? It might be also because their kids are saying, you know what, I am not going to carry the burden of being your educator. Go to Adoption Mosaic and take one of their classes. We're seeing, and then as a result of them doing that, they're like, oh, this is really great work, and this is actually helping my family stay intact as a result of learning how to become adoption competent. And so I think that a huge problem that we have is what Shalise said earlier is we don't have a base level of a way to communicate with each other when we talk about adoption competency and when we talk about not being in isolation and growing our community with each other and what that looks like and who we include and who we don't include. And I see in the chat saying, I don't think we should include agencies. I don't think we should include adoptive parents. I don't think we should include, and that is going back to that isolation, I think. And everybody has every right to say however they feel on who they should or shouldn't work with or can or can't work with. We all have the right to have those boundaries and hold those boundaries for ourselves. But that's, to me, where we get fragmented and where we then end up finding ourselves really fragmented. And okay, there's a group over here who doesn't, who or a community over here who we want to support, but they don't support that we are partnering with adoptive parents, or we're educating adoptive parents, or we're and so forth. And then therefore we stop talking to each other. I think that becomes like we can't talk about infinite money and growing and people donating and growing our programs until we figure out how to be in community with each other.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I think that really highlights how difficult it is. People say we're divisive, but we're divisive in a way that it's just we pick what we're comfortable with.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess what's wrong with saying I'm picking this, the both and I'm picking this for me and what is right for me, and I want to also support this over here, that some of what they do isn't 100% what I believe in or I think about. So and I feel like Shalise and I do a really phenomenal job at that, where it's we attempt to create there's almost every adoptee. There's maybe a handful that I I can't align myself with them in any way, shape, or form. I'm going to say the majority of adoptees that are out there, wherever they are on the spectrum of being abolitionist and burn it all down to I'm really pro adoption. I know that I can align myself with any adoptee for the most part, because there's something about them that I can relate to and that we weren't raised with our birth parents. And that baseline allows me to hold space to say, we don't have to think alike. I'm not trying to convince you to be otherwise. I'm not trying to convince you to be like me. I'm not. I want to learn from you. I want to figure out what it is how I can support you and the work that you're doing. And I hope you do the same for me.
That's great. I mean, I think I strive to be that way as well. Yeah. I'm not sure if I live up to that, but I hope sometime I do. Because yeah, I feel the same way, that you take people where they're at and what their experiences and what they're bringing to it. And you don't generally draw hard lines on who you will work with, because that just makes things worse. I'm not to say that I'm going to take money from NCFA. It just wouldn't make sense, especially if strings are attached, and typically they are. But I think that we have to. What you just explained is a really good way of looking at it. I think. Should we ask? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, it's a good way to look at it. And there's this kind of Pollyanna, this rose colored glasses that I want to also be really conscious of, positive toxicity. I'm learning a lot of new words in these last 5 years, right? But this idea of like, yeah, in the perfect world, that is the way that I want to live my life and run the organization and do this work, is in community with others, and others who do and others who don't think like I do. Because everyone who doesn't think like I do is building programs for people who think like they do. Right. And so, like, why can't we support each other? And I can tell you, I think the burnout rate that happens in our adult adoptee community who is trying to build programs, the burnout rate is so high. It is very rare to find an adoptee who has been doing this work for longer than 10, 15 years, because it's so incredibly taxing. If you don't hold that space, if you don't hold that level of there's some common ground, and my job is going to be to figure that out.
Right. Yeah. And you've been in there for more than 20 years. You had a little break in there, I think. Yeah.
I would also add, one of the pitfalls of, advocacy work and any work in this community is that a lot of people come into this work because they're inspired by their journey when they come out of the fog, come into consciousness, and they kind of realize that there's something going on in this wider experience. And like Astrid said, it takes time, I think, to be really good at this work, but also it's hard to work with people when they are still in the midst of working through their own experience.
Right.
And I mean, I feel like, and maybe it's just because I'm not like a huge consumer of social media, but I feel like a lot of influences that I see are people who are in the midst of trying to work out what's happening, what they're learning, and what they're knowing. And I think sometimes too, it's like there is some danger in going to organizations, because there can be harm that can be done to each other, just because we're all at different places, and we don't all have the same, some of us come into this community at a very, very vulnerable time in our experience, and it can be really challenging. And I think that, that's part of it too, is like, at some point, I think for longevity, at some point, the work becomes about the greater good and less about your own personal gain or processing or understanding of you can do that and continue the work. But I think a lot of people do burn out because they're like, okay, well, I got what I needed and now I'm done.
Yeah, longevity is not something that's really, with some exceptions, been celebrated so much in this community. Not to be celebrated, but it's not something that people don't last, and there's good reason why they don't. Yeah. Shauna and Annette, should we get to some questions or?
Yeah, Greg, before you said that people could put their hands up, and Kelly has had their hand up for a bit, so I just want to
Oh, and so
acknowledge
does Rebecca. I just couldn't see it because her hand is
Yeah,
blends into the wall.
so we'll do Kelly first and then Rebecca.
All right, sure. Kelly, why don't you go ahead? And sorry, Kelly, I just looked up and saw the hands up.
Oh, that's fine. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm just going to start my video so you can see me. I don't know if you can see me. I appreciate everything everyone said, and I think that the thing I see as the most important in terms of changing the narrative is obviously getting organized, and a lot of you have touched on that tonight. And I think we have to tackle this from all of those angles that were on the poll. It has to be legislative policy change. It has to be media awareness campaigns. And I guess the thing I've just been thinking about as everyone's been talking is how do we organize? Because I've heard that there's that 1% of the US population are adoptees. So if we have 330 million people, that means there's over 3 million adoptees in our country. So how do we just get more adoptees doing this work and aware? I know I've been to a couple adoptee conferences in the last couple of years, and I know about several different adoptee organizations like Bastard Nation and NAP and Adoptees United and I think it's called Adoption Knowledge Affiliates. There's so many different adoption organizations that are trying to unite adoptees, and I think we need all of them. But I am just wondering if anyone has any thoughts about how do we bring more adoptees into the conversation, and how do we unite to get legislative change and to forward to change the narrative. And yeah, I think there just needs to be more books, more movies like Rebecca Autumn Sampson's movie, and just more awareness, which I think I'm really grateful for, like the influencers on TikTok and Instagram. I follow a lot of them, and I think they're starting to change the narrative, but it needs to be like exponentially more in terms of all the different strategies that were listed on the poll. And I think even more.
Thanks, Kelly. That's really good comments. And I mean, I can say that Adoptees United formed around the issue of getting more adoptees involved and organized, as well as diversifying who is at the table to speak. And we deliberately have a board that's very diverse, and it's something that we continue to work on. And that will be very much part of our retreat at the end of this month. Is how do we build an organization that is as unified as it can be, because we're so different, and can move forward and actually work on changing the narrative of adoption. Yeah, so thank you. And Rebecca.
I feel like I've got like 1,000 thoughts. I don't even know where to begin.
I do too.
But I joined tonight because infinite money has always been my lottery plan.
Uh-huh.
So if I ever won the lottery, I always had this dream of one of the things I would use a huge chunk of the money was to pull together whoever in the moment were the heavy hitters of adoption reform and put them all in a room together and say, I've got a chunk of money. Mm-hmm. What can we really do?
Right.
And how can we really push this movement forward? But from tonight's conversation, I just want to say a couple things. One is, I don't think we've been that far off with our history in adoption reform. We just haven't been able to gain momentum. But I think when you look at the states that have been, if we're just talking about reform around OBC, for example, mm-hmm. just talking there, which I think for a lot of us as adoptees is the critical piece of legislation. It's not the only, but it's critical, right? The states that have been successful, when you drill down to what really happened at the end, when it finally got pushed across the finish line, you had a small core group of people who literally gave their lives. And I mean, like all day, every day, all their energy, all their money, whoever supported them financially, to make that effort happen. So if you take that and extrapolate to infinite money, then that's what we need to do. We need to spread the money into states that are about to cross the finish line and support whoever those. It's usually not a big team of people in the end. There was a whole lot of people getting them there, no doubt about it. I know I don't ever want to disparage that, all the energy of all the people, but every state, what we can think about, it's been successful. Most of us who've been following it closely, and I've been at this for over probably 35 years now, you can find like a core 5 to 10 people that somehow figured out how to give up their job, how to leave their kids, how to, not tend to life so that they could cross the finish line, and they needed financial support for that. So, I feel like that's something that if there was a central entity that had the money that could start watching for when these states are about to get there and say, who are your key people that we need to now shoot them a salary, do pay their expenses, whatever, so we can cross the finish line on these and finally get to all 50 states giving equal access to adoptees. But that's one issue. I mean, you guys are bringing up so many issues that need attention. I don't know that there's, you would need infinite money to tend to it all. Like the idea of services to post-adoption, clinical services to post-adoption, as well as search and reunion services post-adoption to adult adoptees, feels to me like a whole separate conversation that there are agencies who want to support that. I am the executive director of one who has been fighting mightily to say we want to serve adult adoptees as much, if not more, than anyone else that we're serving out there, and really struggling to find funding for it. I think Shalise said you can find funding for people who want to support the stuff you're doing for people under the age of 18. Right. Really hard to find funding for anything you're doing for adults. So that's adult adoptees, and that's birth parents. Parents who've placed children for adoption, having long-term services for them, really hard to fund. I work for an agency where our long-term goal is for us to not have to charge a fee for anything. Mm-hmm. That everyone who came and took part of our services would just give what you can, don't give anything if you can't. And we'd somehow have a funding stream, because that's the other part of my lottery plan, is the rest of it would go to my agency.
So, you said a lot of things there, and Shauna just piped into the chat. Annette and Shauna and Elise and others have been those people that have given up their lives for weeks, if not months, every day doing that work. I will say that at one point in New York, when Annette was going back and forth from her home to Albany, sometimes daily, and having to stay in hotels, we put out word that these are expensive. This is expensive. And we raised $2,000 in like the matter of 3 hours. People are willing to do that if they're seeing good work being done. Well, I do like the idea of Shalise's foundation. I think that would really do a lot if it's adoptee centered and driven. Yeah.
Yeah, that was when we were waiting for it to be voted on, Greg.
Right.
So everyone was watching it very, very closely at that point in time.
Yeah, when you're doing the work months earlier, they don't see that. Yeah.
But then it also came to the point where we felt, which goes along with how this whole conversation started, right? We felt uncomfortable taking the money.
Right, I know.
Like we were like, felt a little dirty, not gonna lie.
Which is weird. You're spending money on hotels.
If it could be someone's salary, then you wouldn't have that feeling, right? Like if you could say, I'm being paid to do this now. Like I can legitimately do this as a job, whether you call it a lobbyist or not. I don't know if that really matters. And that's a Greg question, I suppose. But if you were saying, I'm providing a professional service that I'm being paid a salary for by this entity, That's one way in which to tackle it. But I think, in terms of how you spend money, we have to think about that's the effort it takes to do this. I don't think there's any other magic way that money works to take care of that issue.
Right.
And we do have like some significant gaps that have occurred over the years. The American Adoption Congress is not doing what it used to do. It ran into huge problems in leadership and it fell apart. And so it is not doing what it once did. And it once did a lot. And it was almost achieving same level voice as NCFA until its leadership ran into a problem. And so the NCFA is now, because of their name, again, as your presenters have already mentioned, they sound like they're for everything adoption. And they're not. And they're not for every adoption agency. My agency would never be a member of NCFA. Not on my last breathing day will we be members of NCFA as it has currently been. However, I will also put out there, NCFA has shifted. They have done some significant shifts in their messaging about what they support. They used to not support access to original birth certificates at all, and they changed that stance recently. They are now having adult adoptees in leadership at NCFA, which they'd never had before. Right. So it could be changing, but the agencies that are members of NCFA are primarily Catholic Charities and Bethany Christian Services. So let's not lump all agencies into NCFA because we're not all there. That is for sure.
And Gladney is a major one too.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, basically your biggie religiously.
They're one and the same.
Yeah. One thing I don't want to forget, you mentioned support for people on the ground, and that's one thing that Adoptees United does do is we provide infrastructure for people in various states. And we build coalitions around the issue of original birth certificates. And so we are providing, with the money that we do raise, we provide support for those on the ground by giving them materials, developing, palm cards, rack cards, developing their website, act as a fiscal agent to these loose-knit groups that need someone to handle their money. So that background is happening. But I wish we could pay what you alluded to as a salary to people, because they're doing the work.
And volunteer organization is like you alluded to, Greg. You have to have a good infrastructure to manage a good quality volunteer program, because what volunteers want is they want to know that what they're doing is helping.
It matters.
And so they need a focus, they need a task, they need to know how that task contributes to the, and then you need to help people see what are your skills and what can you do? Because as all of us who've been doing this following, legislative action, not everyone should be presenting to the General Assembly. Right. Some people do not have that skill and should not be doing it. Other people should not be writing marketing material. They don't have that skill. They shouldn't be doing it. But it's helping people figure out what they can do. Where's your niche? Where can you contribute? How can you help and feel meaningful? And that's how we get, volunteers to do things. The last thing I want to say, because it speaks to what Shalise was saying about research, the other gap we now have is we don't have the Donaldson Institute anymore. And they were starting to head down the path of leading and funding a lot of research connected to adult adoptees. As well as a bunch of other stuff, of course, but they no longer exist either. And I don't know that NCAP is filling that gap yet. That's where Adam Pertman went when he left the Donaldson Institute. Now the Donaldson Institute doesn't exist at all. So I do think we need to back up all this work we want to do with research. I mean, it's critical that we be able to say to people, we're not lying when we say this has impacted us for a lifetime.
Yeah, I think, Rebecca,
from this.
So, Rebecca, I couldn't agree more with you. Research, I think, is so important, and that we have research that's driven by adults, adoptees who are critical thinkers of adoption. We just did a panel 2 months ago on the for adoptee researchers and for We the Experts, which was a great conversation. Greg, I'm sorry I'm interrupting, but I'm also really curious about hearing the other two questions that people have got their hands raised. I don't know if you saw that.
Yep, Elise
Yeah,
and Lena,
Elise.
and then I think now we have Shalice with the question.
Yeah, Elise, Lena, and then Shalice. And then I would really like to get to the questions, some of the questions that were in chat too, because I don't want to let those go ignored.
Right. All right, Elise.
Hi. So I will back up what Becky said. I've been doing this since I was 18. Took a little break during college to do the college thing and then went full hog into it when I was like 22, 23. So we'll just say I've been doing it for a really, really long time because I have gray hair and my hair is all funky tonight. So just trust me, it's been a while. AAC is not doing what it used to do. It's not doing what it was created to do, is to be an umbrella for all these other organizations. And that's sad and it's a bummer. And, you know, we know most of us that we've been there all along the way know what happened with that. It is a tremendous sadness that the Donaldson Institute does not exist anymore. And I will say, for being on the ground, as I was for 3.5 months, I'm just thankful that it was my hometown, because I had support from friends. I had support from my parents. I was able to find a place to stay. I still had to pay for it because my parents don't have a place that I can stay with them anymore. But I had so many people ask me when I was in the legislature, well, who's paying you? Like, where are you getting these funds? And I'm like, it's mostly from me. Like, I'm paying for my apartment downtown by the Capitol. And they'd all sit there and be like, oh, and they're like, well, who's paying for like your RAC cards? And I'm like, well, that's a combination of like our little group. Because in Louisiana, we had a core group of 5 people plus a representative. And we had a couple of extra people that testified here and there, but the people that worked on the ground day in and day out for those entire time from March until June were 5 people. Myself and 4 others. And we were very fortunate to have an anonymous donor who contributed thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to pay for our lobbyists. But not every state has that. And the anonymous donor also paid for our RAC cards and our other stuff. But to get it done, you really had to be on the ground every single day. I think I only missed a day and a half out of the entire legislative session at the Capitol. I had a half a day where I had to go to a doctor's appointment, and a day where I couldn't go because I had something else I had to do. But besides that, I was there every single day from March 15th until the end of the session, June 6th. And to be able to do that, to drop your family, do all that kind of stuff, you have to have some funds. I just wasn't lucky that I was in a position that I was doing work in a place where I grew up. So I had a lot of friends that would let me sleep on their couch, and my parents let me sleep on their couch before moving on to renting an apartment for the rest of the time. But I think if you're going to go down that path of doing access for pre-adoption birth certificates, that's the kind of financial that's what's required of it. You can't just do it on a whim. You can't do it with someone who's only going to come to the Capitol here, there, and yonder. You've got to have something else. And I agree that all these other things are incredible necessities. I think post-adoption support and all the mental health and everything else. And I was joking with Becky earlier, Rebecca, that maybe I'm dating myself because I'm getting to be in that age group where closed adoptions were the norm, but now most of us are getting really old and gray and dying off. So maybe there's a whole new generation of adoptees who are more open adoption or have more things going on that don't care as much about having their birth certificate, and they need other support. And that's all just things to think about.
Yeah, I think that's something we have not yet tapped into that we need to, is that the younger adoptees that are, late teens, early 20s, even into the early 30s, have a very different experience. And congratulations on Louisiana. That was great work. But it's interesting to hear that thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars was part of that effort. And I think that,
well, I'll tell you, altogether, it probably ended up being close to 40,000.
Yeah. And so
40 to 50, give or take.
Yeah, and that's not
That's not
surprising.
including like what I paid for me to fly down there, what I paid for me to separate, to do my stuff,
Right.
but for materials, for lobbyists, for all that other stuff.
Right. Thanks. And Lena, go ahead. You're on mute.
I think I just wrote a list of some comments because I wanted to keep it brief and be conscientious of everyone else here. I think that we give too much credit to organizations in terms of letting them be the end all and be all. We need to be doing the work and not putting our faith in the organizations. And also with the organizations, you have to know who's running them. Like there are some organizations that are mentioned here, and those people have aligned with people that I won't align with just because they're supporting a sexual assault abuser. So you have to look, is that someone I'm willing to align with? Well, no. So you have to think about who's leading this. Have they been properly vetted? Are there people on the boards, people that we're going to want to connect with and collaborate with? Because that is going to be an impression of you. Who you align with is who you're going to be, known as. Second, I think that we really need to look to intersections, and if we deal with intersections first, we're going to get a lot further. Like here, we're talking about original birth certificates. And personally, to me, that's not even an issue for me. Like I'm a transracial, transnational adopted person. That's the least of my concerns. You know what I mean? I'm like these things, like the overturning of Roe versus Wade, that's huge. I'm going to be in Minnesota State next week talking about that. I make my money going to universities, doing trainings, talking to people. That's how I survive, right? But the intersections are important. We have to look outside ourselves. We're only going to be as good as the people we surround ourselves by. So if we're going to collaborate, we're going to work together, we're going to unite all of that. It's going to be a challenge if we all have different things. If you're doing original birth certificates and I'm going back to the orphanage dealing with corruption, that's going to be a different thing. So it's like we have to decide, what are we going to do? And we're going to be better if we deal with the intersections and the marginalization, because then it's going to benefit everyone. And then the next thing is research. Like I'm doing research now, but I think the narrative also needs to change in terms of lived experience is just as much as research, because I can put out any research I want and skew it how I want, just like anybody else can. So even if I'm doing it, yeah, there's going to be maybe some bias there. Just like if an agency is doing it, there's going to be lots of bias there. So I'm going to be, as an individual person that has my name out there, I'm going to think about who I'm going to take my money from, because that's going to be on me. And are there strings attached to that? So it's whatever our boundaries are, and they're going to be different. Nothing's right, nothing's wrong. But we have to think about that because we're not all going to be able to align on that. Some people are saying reform, some are saying abolition. You can't really find a common place there. So it's we can't possibly organize in one movement for everything because there's so much to be done. So I'm saying we can be greater together. We need to stretch. We need to I've been in donor conceived groups learning about that. I've been going to groups to stretch because that's what I talk about on my platform. So I have to do the work too. But all of us here, if we look around the room, it's pretty homogenous. It's pretty homogenous. So we're going to be better when we look to other groups, just I'm going to be better. I'm not the end all and be all. I'm not perfect. I don't think I am, but I'm looking to other people too, to learn more, to help them. And when I help other people, that's going to help all of us. So I think that's all my comments. And thank you for listening.
Thanks, Lena. That's really good comments. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Lena. It's so good to see you. And I was thinking the same as far as yes, records and open records, and it serves many of the people I serve. Absolutely. I care about it because I care about the people who other adoptees, but it doesn't serve my experience or a lot of the transracial international adoptees that we serve as well.
Right. I worry about the overemphasis on original birth certificate. I mean, I'm deeply involved in that, but I worry about the overemphasis of that as the issue, and it has to be wider and broader and include more people. Yeah. Doesn't mean I give up on that issue. It just means that it's not the end all be all, as Lena said. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Shalise.
Well, I was going to say that, part of the challenge with funding is the practice of adoption itself. Right. Going to agencies, how they talk to parents, how they are training parents about adoption is a disservice to the entire family system. There are very few agencies, and there are some out there who are trying to practice adoption differently. And but I think, you know, there's very little emphasis on adoptive parenting as a long game, being prepared to support your child into young adulthood, because that is an area where we are seeing anecdotally, and I'm sure will be a study out there sometime soon, hopefully, that young people 18 to, I mean, 35, 50s, right? They are all still struggling how to be in community with their adoptive parents, especially after they have come to their own understanding about the system of adoption and how their personal experience and their parents' actions have played out in that system. And agencies are not preparing. The parents that we are seeing at Adoption Mosaic are not people who are prepared to be dealing with adoption when their kids are 26. And to me, that, you know, and I think there's a good debate between reform and abolition, because I don't know how you reform that. I mean, part of it starts with training social workers. A lot of social workers who go into adoption are not trained in adoption. They're not trained to even think about the lived experience of adopted people. I mean, I bet if you polled a bunch of social workers who work in adoption, they'd be like, oh yeah, no one ever told me that was important. I should, like, oh yeah, that's not a bad idea, learning about the lived experience of adopted people. Like, they themselves, you know, they're just people too. They get caught up in the dominant narrative of adoption. They're building families. They're creating, you know, they're finding families for kids without homes, and they're saving lives, and they're giving opportunities, all of those things. And I think that works against us at this end of the experience, because now everybody thinks it's done and over and good. And so I think that, you know, like, that is one of the challenges of getting funding is, I mean, it's really hard to fight that. And I also want to say, I agree with Lena, like, we all can't all be one thing to all people. And I think that people who work in abolition are really important. People who work in reform are really important. And I actually think people who are working on original birth certificates in the States are important to international adoptees, because identity rights are important to everyone, all adopted people. And you all are laying the groundwork and the map for how do you get this done, because there is no central. There are people who are wanting to form central adoptee lobbyist groups, but then we need some framework about how do you lobby?
Right.
You know, how do you do that? Oh, you need to be able to find people who can be there all the time, every day, because of how strong the narrative of adoption is, and what people believe about it, and how much time it takes them to let go of that idea. I mean, because, right, adoption is entrenched in the patriarchy, white supremacy, nationalism, Christianity. I mean, all of these really strong systems have poured into adoption and has made it look like this monolithic, simple, good thing. And to convince people that it is a vast spectrum of experience that needs a whole range of services that is full of complexity and nuance is, you know, we need infinite money to try to tackle that.
Right. All the work that I've done, whether it's in the courts with intercountry adoptees and citizenship or OBCs, it's always having to fight against that dominant narrative that you come into the room and things are already stacked against you. No matter if it's intercountry adoptees or domestic adoptees or whatever, that dominant narrative follows you into the room, and it trounces you. It's really hard to get over. And that's why I think money, I don't raise the issue of money and infinite money as a way to, like, everyone should, you know, we should all be fully funded and make our money off adoption. It's to change the narrative. It's to have the resources so that we can do the work that needs to be done. Yeah. And it's frustrating that it's really frustrating that you can't do that work because the resources don't exist, and that burnout that everyone has talked about, and everyone knows who's ever done the work, the burnout. You want to quit. There are times, and I've talked to many people who want to quit every day. I'm going to quit. And for some reason you stay on. And so those are really, really excellent points you just made. Thank you. So it's 7:40. We probably have a hard stop here pretty soon. Is there any other questions or comments? Oscar, do you have anything? Or Annette or Sean, have you seen anything on the chat?
Yeah, we have like a little Google Doc going, Shauna and I do. So just
Okay.
want to hit a couple of those if we could.
Sure.
There was one from Carol way back almost 2 hours ago when we started, who said, what about putting together continuing legal education classes for legal institutions, which would educating regarding adoptee issues bring in money as well? And it would be a captive market since most states mandate a minimum number of credits per attorney yearly. Sorry.
Okay, so I can probably answer that as an attorney because it's a great idea. It's something that I've really loved to do. I lack the resources to do it. And that is to teach other attorneys what these issues are in adoption for adult adopted people. They would pay for this. They would learn from it. And they'd come away with it with possibly a changed understanding of what adoption really is, whether it's original birth certificates, whether it's intercountry adoption, whether it's placement. They need to be educated, and they are always looking for credits, because we have to have a certain number of credits every year. So I think it's a great idea, and it's something that I've really wanted to pursue.
I would love to see some programming at universities before they even become attorneys. And social workers before they become social workers, before they become educators, before they become kindergarten teachers, all of that. That education needs to happen so much earlier than it's happening. And I think, if we can get into hearing that Lena is at universities and touring and educating and training folks on various topics, I think that is where we should all be. Because then, this is the long game. Shalise and I talk about the long game all the time. We're in it for the long game. And the long game is 10 years from now, those people that we educated 10 years earlier are going to be the ones who are going to be the support people. Not changing a 65-year-old white man attorney who is perpetuating the adoption and the way we talk about adoption and all. We're not. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to spend a lot of time trying to convince that person that we've got something. We want them to think differently about adoption.
Right. And Lena said in the comments that she's created a course that she charges for and people get credits. And that's a perfect idea of spreading that narrative and having control over your own, what you want to present. I love it. Okay. And then what else? Oh, Shalise.
Just going back to the whole research thing. And I think part of, like working with traditional organizations, and even within, of course, attorneys, you have to be an attorney, or, social work programs want social workers and people with master's degrees and PhDs to be presenting information. And I think that is also one of the, this might just be a personal sore spot for me, but there's a lot of education elitism in the adoption, like authorities. Like if you're not degreed, then you don't have any expertise. And I think that can be real. Like NCFA, like they like people who have MSW, PhD. Those people are presenting into that conference, or that's what they're interested in. And so I think that is one of the challenges of lived experience organizations and people who are promoting lived experience, is that for some reason that has way less value than MSW or LCSW or PhD. And not that those things aren't important, because those degrees and those areas of studies are important, especially in terms of adoption. And yet it also, in this other way, it's not those particular people, but the reliance on those kinds of degrees and education that make people feel like they're experts on adoption is a barrier for changing some of those systems, I think.
Right. Annette, what other questions were there?
Sorry, I was typing something into chat. Caught me off guard there, Greg. Connolly asked way back in the beginning too, with the standard deduction allowed on Form 1040 today, fewer tax filers are itemizing. Do you think this comes into play when people are considering the advantages of donating to 501c3s? So like from a donor's viewpoint.
So my thought is going back to, and Shalise or Ostrid, you may have a different approach, but Ostrid mentioned earlier, that's sort of the difference between big donors, small donors. Big donors is going to matter a lot more. Small donors probably not. Yeah, that's my thought. Ostrid, is that kind of what?
Yep. I will say that I think we've had maybe 2 or 3 adoptive parents say that they would like to put us in their will. And so it's, and in that case, like you said, we would have to have a 501c3 for that to happen, I guess.
Great.
Which I didn't know that.
And Susie Stricker wanted to know, what about donors who want to contribute and they ask specific questions around what someone's mission is and what they do or don't support? How do you answer them? I think that would be very contingent on what the organization itself would represent.
Well,
right?
I mean, here's a real life example. Adoptees United now has a position statement on support of safe and legal abortions. And that may make a difference for some donors, but that's how we feel. And we feel it's important to have that statement. But, you're going to have to be comfortable on both ways. You're taking money from someone that you need to know what their intent is, and someone giving money, then they want to know what that money is going to be used for.
Yeah,
Ostrid, you got highlighted on the screen because your dog was making noise.
Yes, he likes to do that.
Yeah.
It's because he's an adoption abolitionist. So he's just voicing his opinion.
Right. He's like piping in saying, yes, go.
I had one of my local legislators recently say publicly that he lives, it's a candidate, and that he lives with his wife and his adopted dog. And I was like, okay, let's back this train up. Do people really think that your dog is your biological dog? Like, what are you saying here?
Right.
This is what Guapo has to say to that.
Hey, Guaco.
Sean and I said we're going to have our dogs start their own little coalition.
So I think we've probably reached our limit. It's almost 2 hours, which is really good for us. I think, people need to get on with their evenings or late afternoons if you're out in the Pacific Northwest, like Ostrid and Shalise are. Any closing thoughts, or Ostrid or Shalise? You don't have to have any, but if you do, feel free.
I do. My closing thoughts are, thank you for inviting us to this space. And I just really respect the work that you and so I've reached out to a couple of people in the audience that there are some people who are doing some wonderful work out there that I'm aware of. And please do reach out if we haven't connected before. I would absolutely love to schedule a Zoom to get to know you and the programs that you're involved in or that you're building. And I really mean it when I say I want to know about you, and I want to know about the programming that you're doing. And thank you for doing what you do.
Shalise?
Same. Thank you, everyone, for coming and participating. Thanks to Greg and Adoptees United for inviting us and having this conversation. Of course, as you and I have discovered, Greg, we could talk about this
Oh
ad
yeah,
nauseum.
right.
Um,
Yeah, we probably still will. Yeah.
But, I think there's, I live in Portland, Oregon, and there is a local business. They sell delicious mini donuts, but one of their hashtags is community, not competition.
Mm.
And I really respect that because I feel like that is definitely a philosophy to live by in the adoption community. We can be together and be working towards different goals, but we can be together. We can be a community without having to all want the same thing. And, how exactly that looks, I'm not sure yet. But I feel like at Adoption Mosaic, where we are trying to figure that out and doing an okay job, I think, we do have a lot of space for a lot of people who want different things, but the experience of adoption is the thing that keeps us all together. And so I think if we can find a way to monetize that, we will have that infinite money. So everyone keep doing your good work and keep up the advocacy and your dedication. And thank you.
Thanks, Shalise and Ostrid, and also Annette and Shauna for helping out with everything, and everyone who had participated. I will say before we go, part of this event, and even just raising the issue that we've been talking about for a long time, is there is a great deal of responsibility if you do raise money from people intended to be used for whether it's organizing or programs or advocacy, and we take that responsibility very seriously. So this is a really conscious effort to try to figure out what's best as a structure to if for instance we were able to raise significant money, and how what's the responsibility of an organization that has money that could make a difference. And so these are all issues that we will be discussing probably for years, but more specifically we'll be discussing in the late October. And everything that everyone has said, has contributed, has taken the poll, will influence that discussion. And I really appreciate everyone being open and honest and participating. So thank you much.